The morning my husband threw the paternity results across the kitchen table and told me to get out of his house, I was holding a 3-month-old baby who had done nothing wrong except come into the world looking nothing like the man who was supposed to love him. That moment lives in me still. Not as grief anymore, as fuel. I am 62 years old now, and I have spent the better part of 3 decades rebuilding a life that someone tried to take from me before I even understood what was being stolen. I want to tell you what happened. All of it. Because there are women sitting in silence right now who need to know that silence is not the only option. That the truth, even when it takes years to surface, has a way of refusing to stay buried. My name is not important. What I lived through is... I grew up outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a neighborhood where people fixed their own cars in the driveway and took second jobs without complaining about it. My father worked at a sheet metal plant for 31 years. My mother cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week, on top of raising 4 children. We were not poor in the ways that make the news. We were poor in the quiet, grinding way that nobody writes about, where the rent is always almost due and Christmas is careful, and you learn early that wanting things is a kind of luxury you cannot afford. I was the first in my family to finish a 4-year degree, accounting, at the University of Tulsa, on a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs. I graduated with honors, and a hollowness in my chest that I mistook for ambition. I moved to Dallas at 24, thinking I was starting my real life. I met my husband at a corporate networking event 2 years later. I was an associate at a mid-sized firm. He was the youngest son of the Whitmore family, one of the oldest names in Texas commercial real estate. They had buildings with their name on them in 3 cities. They had a family attorney on retainer the way other people have a family doctor. They had a way of occupying space, any room, any conversation, as though the world had been arranged for their comfort specifically. He was handsome and easy to talk to, and nothing like what I expected from a man with that much money behind him. He asked me about my work. He listened when I answered. He called me the next day and the day after that, and by the 3rd week he was driving 40 minutes just to have lunch with me at a sandwich counter near my office because I said I liked the soup there. My mother asked me once if I was sure about him. Not about him as a person, but about what came with him. I told her he was different from his family. I believed that when I said it. We married in the spring, small ceremony, his family's idea. His mother explained it as a preference for intimacy. I learned later it was because they were not ready to fully acknowledge the marriage to their social circle. A girl from Tulsa, with no family connections and no inheritance, was not the match they had planned for their son. But he chose me anyway, and I held on to that like it meant everything. I moved into the Whitmore family's main property outside of Dallas, a house so large that I got turned around in my own hallway for the first month. My mother-in-law was cordial the way a hotel concierge is cordial, polished and impenetrable. My father-in-law shook my hand once, and then treated me like an employee he had inherited from a previous administration. And my brother-in-law, my husband's older brother by 4 years, was the one who scared me in ways I could not name at first. He had a particular way of looking at me. Long and slow and slightly past my face, like he was measuring something. He made comments that landed wrong, the kind you couldn't quite report because the words themselves were technically fine, but the intent underneath them was not. My husband never noticed. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Women who grow up without money learn to make themselves comfortable in uncomfortable spaces. I had been doing that my whole life. The first Christmas after our wedding, the whole family gathered at the main house. Out-of-town cousins, business partners, neighbors who had known the Whitmores for 40 years. It was a beautiful, suffocating event. I wore a green dress my mother-in-law had selected for me as a gift. I smiled until my face ached. My husband left early in the evening to take an urgent call. My mother-in-law was occupied at the far end of the house with her bridge circle. My father-in-law had gone to bed claiming a headache. I was in the kitchen refilling my water glass when my brother-in-law came in and closed the door behind him. I do not need to describe what happened in clinical detail. What I will tell you is that he had been drinking heavily all night, and that when I tried to leave, he blocked the door, and that the glass of water I was holding ended up shattered on the tile floor, and that afterward I was sitting against the kitchen cabinet not fully understanding what had just occurred when my husband walked in looking for me and found me there, pale and shaking, and my brother-in-law was nowhere in sight. I told my husband something was wrong. I told him I felt sick. He helped me upstairs and sat with me until I stopped shaking, and then I told him I must have had too much to drink because I could not say the real thing. I did not have the words for it yet. And somewhere deep inside me, I already knew that even if I found the words, the room I was in, the house I was in, the family I had married into, none of it would protect me from what those words would cost. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks later. My husband was overjoyed. He was warm and attentive in ways he had not been since before our wedding, and for a while the joy of it let me push the Christmas night into a compartment in my mind that I kept locked. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself the baby was my husband's because I needed that to be true. I told myself a lot of things that year. My son was born in October. He was healthy and loud and immediately, undeniably, not what the Whitmore family expected him to look like. My husband's family was fair-skinned and blue-eyed going back generations. My son came out with dark hair, olive skin, and eyes that were a deep, unsettling brown. My husband stared at him in the hospital room with an expression I could not read. For 3 months, I watched my husband become a stranger. He did not hold our son unless prompted. He answered my questions in single sentences. He stopped coming to bed at his regular time. I knew what was coming. I could feel it gathering the way you feel a storm before the sky changes. When the results came, he had gone behind my back to have the test done. He did not ask me. He collected a sample from our son during a diaper change and sent it to a private lab. The morning he put the envelope on the table, I knew from his face alone what it said before I touched it. He told me the baby was not his. He told me I had humiliated him and his family. He told me to pack what I needed for a few days and get out of his house. He said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. He said it the way you say something when you have already made every decision that follows. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a very long time. My son was in the nursery upstairs, asleep, with no idea that his life was being arranged around him. And I looked at my husband and felt something clarify inside me. Something I had been keeping soft out of fear, and I said, "You should ask your brother." He told me to leave. I went to my parents in Tulsa. My mother met me at the door and took my son from my arms and did not ask me a single question for 3 days. She just fed me and washed my clothes and let me sleep. My father sat with me on the back porch on the second evening and said he was going to go to Dallas, and I told him no, that I needed to handle this myself. He looked at me for a long time and then he nodded and went back inside. On the 4th day, I called a legal aid clinic in Tulsa. The woman who answered transferred me to an attorney named Sandra, who specialized in family law and had a secondary focus on assault cases. When I told her everything, including Christmas night and my brother-in-law and the kitchen and what I had never told anyone before that phone call, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I believe you. And I want you to know that what you're describing is a crime." No one had said that to me out loud before. I had to ask her to repeat it. Sandra explained that the statute of limitations in Texas gave us a window. She explained that the DNA results, the very same results my husband had intended to use against me, were actually the most important piece of evidence I had. Because if our son's father was my brother-in-law, that was documented proof that something had happened between us. And since I was testifying it was not consensual, the burden shifted. The first thing we needed was to confirm the connection definitively. Sandra filed a motion requesting a court-ordered paternity test that would include my brother-in-law as a potential subject. His attorney fought it. They spent 2 months fighting it. But Sandra had a judge who was not impressed by family names, and the order went through. My brother-in-law's sample confirmed it. My son was his. When my husband received that result through his own attorney, something broke open in him. He called me. He had never been a man who cried easily, but he was crying when I answered. He said he had known something was wrong that Christmas night, that when he found me on the kitchen floor, he had noticed things he had not let himself think about. He said he had been angry at me because being angry at me was easier than looking at what his family actually was. He said he was sorry. I told him sorry was a beginning, not an ending. He asked what he could do. I told him I needed him to tell the truth, all of it, to anyone who asked, including on the witness stand if it came to that. He said yes. Sandra had been making calls in the meantime. She had a contact at the Dallas County DA's office, a prosecutor named Marcus, who had built a quiet reputation for taking on cases that other people considered too complicated or too connected. When Sandra briefed him on the evidence, he asked to meet with me in person. I drove to Dallas with my mother and my son. I sat across from that prosecutor, and I told him everything from the beginning: the kitchen, the glass on the floor, the months I spent pretending I was not falling apart. The morning my husband put that envelope on the table. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. He asked if I was prepared for what a trial would involve, and he asked if I had any reason to believe there were other victims. I told him I didn't know about other victims for certain, but I told him about a conversation I had overheard at a family event 2 years before, a cousin whispering to another woman, something about my brother-in-law, and an incident at a company retreat that had been quietly settled. I told Marcus the cousin's name. It took his investigator 3 weeks to find her. Her name was Patricia, and she had worked in the Whitmore family's leasing office for 4 years before she left suddenly with a severance package that included a non-disclosure agreement. She was living in Houston, remarried, quiet. When Sandra and I showed up at her house, she opened the door and looked at me and said, "He did it to you too, didn't he?" Patricia's story was not identical to mine, but the pattern was the same. A company event, alcohol. A private moment he had engineered, and then the weight of the family's power pressing down on her until she signed the papers and disappeared. She had told her husband everything before they married. He was the one who encouraged her to talk to us. "I signed that NDA because I was 26 and I didn't have any money, and I didn't think anyone would believe me over them," she said at our kitchen table in Houston. "But I've been waiting for someone to knock on this door for 7 years." Patricia agreed to testify. Her NDA, Marcus informed the Whitmore family's attorneys, was not legally binding in the context of a criminal proceeding. Their response was to offer me a settlement of $800,000 in exchange for dropping all complaints and signing my own non-disclosure agreement. Sandra called me with the number. There was a pause on the line where she waited for my reaction. I told her no. The trial took place the following spring. My brother-in-law's attorneys painted me as a woman who had an affair, who had been caught, and who had invented an assault allegation to save myself from the consequences. They presented my husband's original paternity results as evidence of my deception. They called witnesses who testified about my character, 2 women from the Whitmore social circle who had never once had a real conversation with me but were happy to discuss my demeanor at parties. My husband sat in the gallery every day of that trial. He did not have to be there. His lawyer had told him staying away would be cleaner for him personally. He came anyway. When he took the stand, he told the truth about what he had found when he walked into that kitchen on Christmas night. He told the truth about the weeks after, the way his brother had minimized it, the way his mother had suggested I was emotional and dramatic, the way his father had told him that sometimes women in new marriages felt overwhelmed and acted in ways they later regretted. He told the jury that at the time he had let himself believe them because he had been believing them his entire life. He stepped down from the stand and he looked at me, and something passed between us that was not love anymore, but was something adjacent to it, something like recognition, like 2 people who had both survived the same storm from different sides of it. Patricia testified for 2 hours. She was steady and clear, and she did not look at my brother-in-law once. She looked at the jury. I testified for a day and a half. I told them everything, including the parts that made me look weak, the months of silence, the pretending, the way I had almost let myself believe it was my fault. Prosecutors will tell you that juries respond to honesty more than perfection. I was not perfect. I had been a scared young woman in an impossible situation, and I had made imperfect choices. I said that plainly, and I did not apologize for it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the verdict came, I was in the hallway outside the courtroom with my mother and Sandra and Patricia and my son, who was almost 4 years old by then and had spent the morning drawing pictures of dogs on a legal pad. When Sandra's phone rang and she stepped away to take the call and then turned back to us with her eyes full, I already knew. Guilty. Sexual assault in the 1st degree. Criminal use of a controlled substance. Conspiracy to obstruct a criminal investigation for the NDA and the pressure campaign against Patricia. My brother-in-law was sentenced to 22 years. My mother-in-law issued a statement through the family attorney claiming the verdict was unjust and that her son had been the victim of a calculated scheme. My father-in-law said nothing publicly. He resigned from the board of the family company 6 weeks later, and I have not seen him since. My husband and I did not reconcile as a married couple. There was too much scar tissue between us, too much of what had been done and said and left unsaid. But he had told the truth when it mattered most, and that was not nothing. He remained in our son's life completely. He showed up for school concerts and soccer games and the hard conversations that come later. He told our son that being a father meant showing up, not just sharing DNA. Our son grew up knowing that. The civil settlement that followed the criminal conviction allowed me to return to Dallas and build something. I had spent years as an accountant, managing other people's numbers. I used the settlement to start a nonprofit called the Patricia Fund, named after the woman who opened her door to 2 strangers and told them the truth. We provide legal support, emergency housing, and financial counseling for survivors of assault who are trapped in situations where money and power are being used to keep them silent. In the years since, we have served over 2,000 women across Texas and the surrounding states. Some of them come to us with NDAs they were coerced into signing. Some of them come to us with nothing but a story and a willingness to tell it. We meet them wherever they are. My son is 34 now. He knows his full story. We talked about it seriously when he was in his late teens, not as a source of shame but as context for who he is and where he came from. He has his biological father's coloring and none of his biological father's character, which I consider the best possible outcome. He works in corporate law today, and he has a particular interest in cases involving institutional cover-ups. His grandmother, my mother, says he has my stubbornness and his grandfather's sense of fairness. I think that is exactly right. People ask me sometimes if I regret not speaking sooner, if I wish I had found the words that Christmas night and said them out loud before everything spiraled into what it became. I have thought about that question for 30 years. Here is what I know. I was 29 years old in a house that did not belong to me, married into a family whose last name opened doors I had never been permitted to touch, with no money of my own, no allies close by, and no framework for understanding what had just happened to me as something I had the right to report. The world I was in had been built specifically to make sure women in my position stayed quiet. It was not a failure of my character that I did not immediately know how to dismantle it. It was proof that it was working. What I wish is that the world I am trying to build, through the work I do now, had existed then. I wish there had been a Patricia Fund for me to walk into at 29. That is why it exists. I am 62 years old and I have been standing since the morning my husband slid that envelope across the kitchen table and told me to leave. I have been standing through the trial and through the settlement and through the years of running an organization that never has enough funding and always has more women who need it. I have been standing through my son's graduations and through my mother's funeral 3 years ago and through every moment that could have laid me flat if I had let it. They thought that exposing me would end me. What it did was clarify me. I know who I am in a way I do not think I would have known otherwise. I know what I am capable of. I know how much silence costs, and I know the exact price of refusing to be silent. I have paid both bills, and I can tell you without any hesitation which one I would choose again. If you are watching this and something in my story sounds familiar, I want you to hear me say this directly. What happened to you was not your fault. The silence you kept was not weakness, and it is never too late to tell the truth. Not to a friend, not to a lawyer, not to a room full of strangers, not to yourself. That is all this has ever been. One woman telling the truth loud enough that another woman could hear it. I hope you heard it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and if this story moved you, please share it. You never know who needs it on the other side of that share button. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.